She was wheeled into the courtroom by deputies, sitting in a wheelchair and shouting loudly, "Jordan Beard is Joleen Cummings' cousin." Beard was one of her public defenders, and the claim was not true. She acted as if she had been wrongfully accused, as if she had nothing to do with the case, and as if everything was only a misunderstanding. The defense argued that she was only a co-worker who worked at the same salon, and that there was no evidence proving she had killed Joleen. They also argued that prosecutors had not proven Joleen's death was premeditated, an element required for first-degree murder. At first, the defense argument seemed reasonable. The jury considered it. But then prosecutors presented multiple layers of evidence, and everything changed. What you are about to see is the moment Kimberly Kessler realized that even a plan built around no body and no obvious evidence could still leave behind mistakes. A woman had disappeared without a trace. Her body had never been found, but through forensic techniques and multiple layers of evidence, investigators were still able to identify who the suspect was. Every detail you are about to hear has been verified through court records, the layers of evidence presented by prosecutors, and the jury's verdict at trial. This became a disturbing and haunting case about a woman who walked into a Florida hair salon under a false name and left behind the scene of a disappearance that prosecutors called a homicide. If you have never heard this story before, prepare yourself, because what happened at Tangle's Hair Salon in Yulee, Florida in May 2018 will challenge everything you thought you knew about identity, deception, and what happens when a life built on false names finally has nowhere left to hide. To understand why Kimberly Kessler ended up in that courtroom, and why she was sentenced to life in prison, we first need to understand the full timeline of the case and the lives of the people involved before everything happened. Joleen Cummings was a 34-year-old woman, a mother of 3, and a hairstylist at Tangle's Hair Salon in Yulee, Nassau County, Florida. Her family described her as a responsible mother, which is why her absence on Mother's Day in 2018 immediately alarmed those closest to her. She did not show up to pick up her children, and that detail became important because it did not match her routine, her character, or the role she held in her children's lives. Kimberly Kessler was born on the 9th of May, 1968. She was 50 years old when prosecutors said she killed her co-worker, Joleen Cummings, in May 2018. At the salon, Kessler worked beside Joleen, but she was not using her real name. She was known there as Jennifer Seibert. After investigators began looking into the case, they discovered that Kessler had lived for years under multiple identities. CBS News reported that she had about 18 aliases and had lived in many cities across several states. That background made the case unusual. It was not only the story of a coworker who disappeared after work, it was also the story of a woman who had built a complicated identity cover, moved from place to place, used different names, and eventually arrived at a small Florida salon under a name that was not her own. From a behavioral perspective, years of living under false identities suggested a pattern of hiding, controlling personal information, and avoiding being traced. Before May 2018, Kimberly Kessler was living under the name Jennifer Seibert. That was the name she used while working at Tangle's Hair Salon in Yulee, Florida. Joleen Cummings also worked at that same salon. On the surface, they were co-workers sharing a small workplace, but in a case like this, that kind of setting matters. A salon is not a large, anonymous office. It is a close work environment where people often know each other's schedules, habits, personalities, and conflicts. In a small salon, even minor tension can become visible. Employees may know who opens the business, who closes it, who stays late, who has the last customer, and who leaves with whom. If something happens inside that space, details such as the work schedule, the last appointments of the day, the person who locked the door, and any signs of cleaning can become important. That is why Tangle's Hair Salon was not just a background location in this case. It became the center of the timeline. From a behavioral perspective, Kessler's use of the name Jennifer Seibert was also important. She was not simply a coworker using a nickname. Investigators later learned that she had lived under many different identities over the years. That history suggested a long pattern of hiding, changing names, and controlling how much other people could know about her past. For someone who had spent years moving through life under different names, being questioned or exposed could represent more than embarrassment. It could threaten the entire structure of secrecy she had built around herself. On the 9th of May 2018, just a few days before Joleen disappeared, there were signs that Joleen may have been suspicious of Kessler. According to reporting from News 4 Jax, a coworker said Joleen had a feeling that Kessler was not who she claimed to be. Joleen was reportedly planning to look into Kessler's background. The same reporting also noted evidence of a confrontation between Kessler and Joleen on May 9. This possible confrontation became a significant psychological marker. It did not come from a confession. because Kessler never admitted responsibility, but it helped explain why prosecutors could view Kessler's hidden identity as part of the larger motive. If Joleen had begun questioning who Kessler really was, then she may have been moving closer to information Kessler wanted to keep hidden. For a person whose life had been shaped by false names and evasion, that kind of exposure could have felt like a direct threat. The timeline then moved to the 12th of May, 2018. That was the last day Joleen Cummings was confirmed to have been seen alive. She had been working at Tangle's hair salon. In missing person investigations, the last confirmed sighting is one of the most important points in the entire case. It establishes the final known location and narrows the window in which something could have happened. In this case, the last known location connected directly back to the workplace. That meant investigators had to focus on who was at the salon, what time people left, what evidence remained inside, and whether the scene looked normal or disturbed. The fact that Joleen was last connected to the salon made the workplace timeline critical. It also placed Kessler, her coworker, inside the same circle of scrutiny. In the early morning hours of the 13th of May, 2018, the case took another major turn. According to the state attorney's office for Florida's 4th Judicial Circuit, surveillance footage showed Kessler getting out of Joleen's SUV in the early morning and walking toward a convenience store. She reportedly spoke with an employee and bought a bottle of water. News 4 Jax also reported that Joleen's vehicle was moved to an area near the Home Depot in Yulee at about 1:17 a.m. on Mother's Day. That action was difficult to explain if Kessler had no connection to Joleen's disappearance. When a person is missing, and a coworker is seen with that person's vehicle in the early morning hours, that becomes a powerful investigative detail. Prosecutors could argue that moving the vehicle was not random. It may have been an effort to create the impression that Joleen had left the salon on her own, driven somewhere else, or disappeared after work without anyone else being involved. The movement of the vehicle also mattered because a car can create a false story. If the car is found away from the last known location, it can make investigators consider whether the missing person drove there. But when surveillance connects another person to that vehicle, the meaning changes. The car becomes less like evidence of voluntary travel and more like possible evidence of staging. Later on the 13th of May, 2018, Joleen did not show up to pick up her children. That day was Mother's Day, and it was also connected to Joleen's birthday. Her absence immediately stood out because it did not match who her family knew her to be. She was a mother of 3, and her family described her as responsible and connected to her children. Missing that moment was not normal for her. This is often how a case begins before police even have physical evidence. Family members notice that something is wrong because the person's behavior no longer fits their character. In Joleen's case, not arriving for her children was one of the clearest early signs that she had not simply chosen to leave. It was a break from routine, responsibility, and identity. To her family, that absence carried meaning right away. On the 14th of May, 2018, Joleen's mother reported her missing to the Nassau County Sheriff's Office. Deputies began asking questions and went to the salon to gather information. According to the timeline reported by News 4 Jax, when Kessler learned that law enforcement was asking questions, she contacted the salon owner and said she was leaving town. Leaving the area at that point did not automatically prove guilt. People can leave for many reasons, but in this context, it raised concern. Joleen was missing, her vehicle had been moved, Kessler had been connected to that vehicle, and now, as investigators began asking questions, Kessler was indicating that she would leave town. In an investigation, timing can be as important as the action itself. Her decision to distance herself from the area made investigators look more closely at her role. On the 15th of May 2018, Joleen's vehicle was found. It was a beige 2006 Ford Expedition, and it was located near the Home Depot parking lot. Finding the vehicle without Joleen was a turning point. A missing person case can sometimes involve someone leaving voluntarily, but when the vehicle appears in a separate location and the person remains missing, the situation becomes more serious. The SUV was more than transportation. It was potential evidence. Investigators could examine it for trace material, fingerprints, DNA, signs of movement, and signs of who had been inside it. Its location could also be compared against surveillance footage and witness statements. The discovery of the vehicle helped move the case away from uncertainty and toward a criminal investigation. On the 16th of May 2018, Kessler was arrested in St. Johns County on allegations connected to Joleen's SUV. She was found in a black Kia Soul at a rest area on Interstate 95. Prosecutors also later said she had injuries to her face that were consistent with a struggle. That arrest marked the moment Kessler became the central suspect. She was no longer only a co-worker who had worked at the salon under another name. She was connected to the victim's vehicle, she had left the area, and she had visible injuries that could fit the theory of a physical confrontation. Each detail alone might be open to explanation, but together they formed a pattern that investigators could not ignore. The location of her arrest also mattered. She was not found at the salon, at home, or openly cooperating with investigators. She was found away from the immediate area, at a rest area along a major interstate. For law enforcement, that kind of movement can suggest avoidance, especially when it happens shortly after a coworker disappears, and evidence begins pointing back toward the person who left. Then, on the 22nd of May 2018, Sheriff Bill Leeper announced that investigators had reason to believe Joleen Cummings was no longer alive, even though her body had not been found. In a case without a body, that type of statement is never made lightly. Law enforcement agencies are usually careful with language, especially early in an investigation. To say they believed Joleen was deceased meant the evidence had moved beyond a routine missing person case. That announcement reflected the seriousness of what investigators had found. Even without locating Joleen, they had evidence that suggested something had happened to her. The workplace connection, the vehicle movement, the timeline, Kessler's conduct, and the emerging physical evidence gave investigators a basis to treat the case as a homicide investigation. Psychologically, the timeline showed a progression. First, there was a woman living under a false name in a small workplace. Then there were signs that a coworker may have questioned that identity. Days later, the coworker disappeared after being last associated with the salon. The victim's vehicle was moved. The mother of 3 failed to appear for her children. The family reported her missing. The coworker connected to the vehicle left the area. Then the vehicle was found, and Kessler was arrested. The possible motive in this case was not simple jealousy or financial gain in the usual sense. It appeared more closely tied to identity, exposure, and control. Kessler had spent years living behind different names. If Joleen was beginning to question that false identity, then the threat may have been personal and direct. For someone who had built a life around avoiding detection, being exposed could have felt like losing control of everything she had carefully hidden. The prosecution would later build the case around the idea that Joleen did not vanish voluntarily. They argued that she had been harmed, that the scene had been cleaned, that the vehicle had been moved, and that Kessler's behavior after the disappearance showed awareness and concealment. The early timeline gave that theory its foundation. By the time investigators publicly said Joleen was likely no longer alive, the case had already changed. It was no longer simply about finding a missing mother. It had become an investigation into what happened inside and around Tangle's hair salon, who had access to Joleen in the final hours, and why Kimberly Kessler, a woman living under another name, had become connected to the most important evidence in the case. The case was not discovered through a traditional scene where a body was found. It began with Joleen Cummings' unusual absence. When she did not show up to pick up her children on Mother's Day, her family immediately knew something was wrong. That absence did not match who Joleen was as a mother, and it did not fit her normal routine. On the 14th of May, 2018, Joleen's mother reported her missing to the Nassau County Sheriff's Office. From that report, investigators began looking into the places and people closest to Joleen's final known movements. They checked Tangle's hair salon, reviewed work schedules, looked for Joleen's vehicle, and began identifying the last people who may have had contact with her. At first, the case could still be handled as a missing person investigation. There was no body, no immediate public answer, and no clear explanation for where Joleen had gone. But the direction of the investigation changed quickly. Her vehicle was found away from her. Surveillance footage connected Kimberly Kessler to that vehicle. Then investigators began discovering evidence inside and around the salon that suggested something more serious had happened. Those details changed the meaning of the case. What began as a missing person report gradually became a homicide investigation. For Joleen's family, the report was the beginning of a search. For investigators, it became the first step in uncovering a case built not around a recovered body, but around absence, evidence, and the traces left behind. The investigation into Joleen Cummings' disappearance focused on several key areas: Tangle's hair salon, Joleen's vehicle, Kimberly Kessler's vehicle and personal property, a storage unit connected to Kessler, surveillance footage, purchase records, DNA evidence, and internet search history. Because Joleen's body was never found, investigators had to build the case through evidence that could show what happened without relying on a recovered body. The most important location was Tangle's hair salon in Yulee, Florida. According to the state attorney's office for Florida's 4th Judicial Circuit, blood was found inside the salon, and DNA testing confirmed that it belonged to Joleen. Prosecutors also said there were signs of a significant cleanup effort at the scene. That detail mattered. because it suggested that someone had tried to remove or reduce visible evidence after a violent event had taken place. Investigators also reviewed purchase records and surveillance footage connected to Kessler. Prosecutors said Kessler bought items such as an electric knife, zip ties, and trash bags. She was also captured on camera disposing of multiple large trash bags in a dumpster after Joleen disappeared. In a case without a body, these actions became highly important. They helped prosecutors argue that the scene had not only been disturbed, but actively managed after the crime. Joleen's blood was found on a boot, a sock, and scissors connected to Kessler's vehicle and storage unit. Investigators also found one of Joleen's fingernails inside a blue bin in Kessler's storage unit. Those findings connected Joleen's biological evidence to places and objects associated with Kessler. For prosecutors, this was one of the strongest links between the victim, the suspect, and the suspected aftermath of the attack. The investigation also included digital evidence. Prosecutors presented internet searches connected to phrases such as Joleen Cummings, no body, no crime, along with searches related to female killers. These searches were significant because they suggested awareness of how a case might be handled if a body was never recovered. They also helped prosecutors argue that Kessler understood the seriousness of what had happened and was thinking about how investigators might prove it. Taken together, the evidence formed a layered case. The blood and DNA showed that Joleen had been seriously harmed inside the salon. The cleanup signs suggested concealment. The movement of Joleen's vehicle suggested an attempt to shift attention away from the salon. The purchase records and trash disposal helped establish actions after the disappearance. The storage unit evidence tied Joleen's remains of biological evidence to Kessler's property, and the internet searches gave prosecutors insight into possible awareness and intent. This is what made the case different from a typical investigation. There was no recovered body, but there were many traces left behind. Each piece of evidence carried weight because it supported the next. By connecting the salon, the vehicle, the storage unit, the surveillance footage, the purchases, the DNA, and the searches, investigators built a case that showed Joleen did not simply vanish. The evidence pointed to a planned effort to harm her, hide what happened, and make the truth harder to uncover. Kimberly Kessler became the focus of the investigation because several different details pointed in her direction at the same time. She was not just a random person connected to Joleen Cummings. She worked with Joleen at Tangle's hair salon, but she was doing so under the name Jennifer Sibbert. That alone raised questions once investigators learned more about her background. Then the timeline placed her close to key moments after Joleen was last seen. Surveillance footage connected her to Joleen's vehicle. She left the area when law enforcement began asking questions, and prosecutors later said she had injuries that could be consistent with a physical struggle. At first, Kessler's connection to the case was tied strongly to the vehicle, but as investigators looked deeper, she was no longer viewed only as a person associated with Joleen's SUV. The inquiry began to uncover a broader pattern. Kessler had lived under multiple identities over many years. She had used numerous aliases and had lived in many different places. For investigators, that history mattered because it suggested that Kessler had experienced hiding personal information, changing names, and moving without leaving a clear personal trail. That background also changed how her conduct after Joleen's disappearance was interpreted. A person using a false identity, leaving town as police begin asking questions, and being tied to a missing coworker's vehicle creates a very different picture than a simple workplace acquaintance. Each fact became more meaningful when placed beside the others. Her false name, her connection to the salon, her contact with Joleen's vehicle, and her movement away from the area all helped investigators narrow their focus. After Kessler was taken into custody, the case did not move smoothly toward trial. Her behavior during the legal process became another major part of the courtroom history. Reports from News 4 Jax described unusual conduct during the pretrial period, including issues related to competency, a hunger strike, and repeated disruptions in court. In 2019, a judge found her not competent to proceed, which meant the court determined she could not yet face prosecution in a meaningful way. She was later sent for treatment and evaluation. By 2020, the court found Kessler competent to be prosecuted. That decision allowed the criminal case to continue. Legally, competency did not decide whether she was guilty or innocent. It only addressed whether she could understand the proceedings and assist in her defense. Once that threshold was met, prosecutors were able to continue building the case toward trial, with Kessler remaining the central suspect in Joleen Cummings' disappearance and presumed death. The case against Kimberly Kessler was strengthened through multiple layers of evidence. Because Joleen Cummings' body was never found, prosecutors could not rely on the kind of direct evidence that appears in many homicide cases. Instead, they had to show a complete pattern. Each layer had to support the next, and together, those layers had to explain why Joleen did not simply disappear, why the Salon became central, and why Kessler became the person investigators focused on. The first and strongest layer was blood and DNA evidence. This evidence placed Joleen in a serious, violent event inside Tangle's hair salon. It also linked traces connected to Joleen with items and property associated with Kessler. In a case without a recovered body, biological evidence became essential. It helped prosecutors argue that something severe happened to Joleen at the workplace, and that the scene was not just the last place she was seen, it was part of the crime itself. The second layer was surveillance footage. The cameras helped show Kessler's connection to Joleen's vehicle and to actions that occurred after Joleen vanished. Surveillance evidence is powerful because it can place a person in a specific location at a specific time. Here, it helped prosecutors connect Kessler to the movement of the SUV, and to conduct that was difficult to explain as innocent. The third layer was Kessler's behavior after the disappearance. Prosecutors pointed to the movement of Joleen's vehicle, Kessler leaving the area, the disposal of large trash bags, and signs that the salon had been cleaned. These were not presented as isolated actions. They were framed as part of a larger effort to conceal what had happened. Moving the vehicle could suggest an attempt to create a false trail. Leaving the area could suggest avoidance. Disposing of bags and cleaning the scene could suggest an attempt to remove evidence. The fourth layer was internet search history. One of the most important phrases connected to the case was, "No body, no crime." For prosecutors, that kind of search was significant because it suggested awareness that the absence of a body could make a prosecution more difficult. It also supported the argument that the person making the search was thinking about how a case might be proven or not proven without a recovered body. The fifth layer was Kessler's history of using false identities. That history helped prosecutors place her behavior in context. She was not presented as someone with a simple misunderstanding about a name. She was presented as someone who had lived for years by concealing who she was, moving between identities, and avoiding easy detection. Together, these layers gave the prosecution a way to build a no-body homicide case. The blood, DNA, cameras, conduct after the disappearance, internet searches, and identity history created a structure that pointed in one direction. Each piece made the others harder to dismiss. Kimberly Kessler's trial took place before a jury in Nassau County, Florida. Jury selection began on the 29th of November, 2021, more than 3 years after Joleen Cummings disappeared. By that point, the case had already become unusual for several reasons. Joleen's body had never been found. Kessler had lived under the name Jennifer Seibert while working at the salon, and the prosecution had to present a case built through evidence, behavior, and timeline, rather than a recovered body. From the beginning, the courtroom proceedings were not ordinary. Kessler was removed from the courtroom after shouting a false claim involving one of her former public defenders. The claim was not true, but the moment became one example of the disruptive conduct that had followed the case through the pretrial process. For the court, this created a difficult balance. Kessler had the right to be present for her trial, but the judge also had to maintain order and make sure the jury could hear the evidence without the proceedings being derailed. The jury did not publicly issue personal comments about Kessler during the trial. There is no reliable public record showing that jurors asked direct questions or made individual statements about her while the case was being tried. What mattered most was how quickly they reached a verdict. The jury found Kessler guilty after a little more than an hour of deliberation. Either way, the timing was short, especially for a case where the victim's body had never been recovered. That short deliberation was significant. In a no-body murder case, prosecutors face a major challenge. They must convince the jury not only that the victim is deceased, but that the defendant caused the death and acted with the required intent. The absence of a body gives the defense space to question what happened, when it happened, and whether the state has truly proven its case. But in Kessler's trial, the jury appeared to view the combined evidence as clear and persuasive enough to reach a verdict quickly. Kessler did not plead guilty. She maintained her position through trial, while the defense worked to challenge the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence. Her courtroom behavior, however, remained part of the public attention surrounding the case. Reports described repeated disruptions at different points in the proceedings. At sentencing, she was removed from the courtroom after shouting, and then followed the rest of the hearing from a separate room. These moments did not decide the case by themselves, but they contributed to the tense atmosphere surrounding the trial. The defense strategy focused on creating reasonable doubt. According to ABC News, Kessler's defense argued that prosecutors had not proven Joleen's death was premeditated, which was required for first-degree murder. News 4 Jax also reported that the defense tried to suggest an alternative explanation involving a workplace dispute. The purpose of that strategy was to weaken the state's theory that Kessler had intentionally planned and carried out the crime. This was a logical defense approach because the prosecution did not have a body. Without a body, the defense could question the exact cause of death, the sequence of events, and the degree of planning. They could argue that the evidence showed suspicion, but not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. They could also argue that if something happened at the Salon, the state had not proven the level of intent needed for first-degree murder, but prosecutors answered that argument with layers of evidence. They pointed to Joleen's blood and DNA at the Salon, and on items connected to Kessler. They presented the cleanup evidence, the movement of Joleen's vehicle, surveillance footage, disposal of large trash bags, purchase records, and internet searches. The state's argument was not built on one single piece of evidence. It was built on the way all of those pieces fit together. For the jury, that structure mattered. The prosecution did not need one item to explain everything. Instead, each layer supported the next. The blood suggested a serious violent event. The cleanup suggested concealment. The vehicle movement suggested staging or misdirection. The trash disposal suggested removal of evidence. The internet searches suggested awareness of how a case without a body could be handled. And Kessler's history of false identities helped frame her as someone who had experienced hiding parts of her life. The emotional weight of the trial was carried by Joleen's family. They had lost a daughter, a mother, and a loved one, but they also had no body to bring home. That made the grief especially difficult. For them, the trial was not only about legal responsibility, it was also about sitting in court and hearing the evidence of what prosecutors said happened to Joleen, while still being denied the final certainty of finding her remains. At sentencing, Joleen's mother, Ann Johnson, spoke about the pain her family continued to live with. She said the family still waited for Joleen to walk through the door, even though they knew that would never happen. She described the loss as a never-ending nightmare. That statement captured the lasting harm of the case. A verdict could establish legal guilt, but it could not return Joleen to her children, and it could not give the family the closure of knowing where she was. On the 9th of December 2021, the jury found Kimberly Kessler guilty of first-degree murder and grand theft auto. The state attorney's office confirmed the verdict and stated that Kessler faced a mandatory life sentence. The verdict showed that the jury accepted the prosecution's case despite the absence of a body. They concluded that the evidence proved Joleen Cummings had not simply vanished and that Kimberly Kessler was responsible. For prosecutors, the verdict was the result of a case built carefully through forensic evidence, digital traces, surveillance footage, behavior, and identity history. For Joleen's family, it was an answer, but not a full ending. The courtroom could determine guilt, it could impose punishment, but it could not undo the loss, and it could not answer the one question that still remained outside the verdict: where Joleen had been taken. On the 27th of January 2022, Kimberly Kessler was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. News 4 Jax also reported that she received a 5-year sentence for grand theft auto to be served at the same time as the life sentence. The sentencing formally closed the trial court phase of the case and confirmed the consequences of the jury's verdict. This outcome was not unexpected once the jury found Kessler guilty of first-degree murder. Under Florida law, a first-degree murder conviction in this case carried a mandatory life sentence. That meant the judge had very limited room to reduce the punishment or impose a lighter sentence. The verdict had already determined her legal responsibility, and the sentencing hearing established the punishment that would follow. For Joleen Cummings' family, the sentence provided accountability, but it did not bring complete closure. Joleen's body had never been found, and that absence remained one of the most painful parts of the case. A life sentence could answer the legal question of guilt and punishment, but it could not return Joleen to her children, and it could not give her family the final answers they still wanted. In practical terms, the sentence meant Kimberly Kessler would spend the rest of her life in prison. The additional grand theft auto sentence ran concurrently, so it did not change the reality of the punishment. The court's decision made clear that the case was no longer a missing person mystery in the eyes of the law. It was a proven homicide, with a permanent sentence attached. Kimberly Kessler is currently serving life in prison without the possibility of parole in the Florida prison system. ABC News reported that she appealed her conviction, but that appeal was denied in 2024. As of now, the conviction and sentence remain in place, and Kessler continues to serve the punishment imposed after the jury. But one part of the case remains unresolved. Joleen Cummings' body has still never been found. For her family, that fact continues to make the case especially painful. The finally motto Hueso, That absence is why the case continues to stay with those who followed it. It is not only a case about a conviction, it is also a case about a mother of three who vanished, a family left without full closure, and a truth that was proven in court even though one of the most important answers remains missing. The Kimberly Kessler and Joleen Cummings case remains one of Florida's most notable workplace homicide cases because of the unusual layers surrounding it. The victim was a 34-year-old mother of three. Her body was never found. The person convicted of the crime had been living under multiple identities. The key location was not an isolated place, but a small hair salon where the two women worked together, and prosecutors had to prove a murder case without the one piece of evidence families and investigators often hope to recover most. What made the case strong was the way the evidence connected. There was no recovered body, but there was blood, DNA. There was surveillance footage, and signs of cleanup inside the salon. There were purchase records, discarded trash bags, internet searches, the movement of Joleen's vehicle, and Kessler's decision to leave the area after police began asking questions. None of these details existed alone. Each one became more important because of how it fit with the others. The case also showed how a person's hidden history can become part of the larger picture. Kimberly Kessler had presented herself at the salon as Jennifer Seibert, but once investigators looked deeper, that identity began to fall apart. Her past use of different names did not prove the case by itself, but it helped explain why the question of identity became so important. In the end, the prosecution was able to present a case where the evidence pointed beyond a disappearance and toward a homicide. The largest message is that a person may be able to hide their identity for a long time, but conduct after a crime often leaves a trail. In this case, the cover of Jennifer Seibert was not broken by a confession. It was broken through detailed investigation, cameras, DNA, Joleen's vehicle, Kessler's storage unit, search history, and Joleen's normal habits all became part of the truth. That is why this case is so important in true crime. It shows that absence can still speak. A missing body does not mean there is no evidence. A false name does not mean a person can never be identified. And a clean scene does not mean every trace is gone. Investigators followed the remaining details, and those details were enough for a jury to reach a verdict. The first lesson is to pay attention when a loved one suddenly disappears in a way that does not match their normal life. Joleen's family knew immediately that it was not normal for her to miss picking up her children on Mother's Day. That concern mattered. It helped start the investigation before more time was lost. The second lesson is that even small workplaces can contain dangerous conflict. A salon can look ordinary from the outside, but people inside that space may carry secrets, resentment, fear, or hidden histories. When someone is concealing their past or their identity, tension in a small workplace can become especially serious. The final lesson is that justice can still be possible in a no-body case if investigators build a strong chain of evidence. In Joleen Cummings' case, her body has still not been found, but the evidence was strong enough for the jury to find Kimberly Kessler guilty. For Joleen's family, that verdict did not erase the pain or answer every question, but it did confirm that Joleen did not simply vanish and that the person responsible was held accountable.